Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Conservation Travel in the Age of COVID, presented by Jim Sano in Court Whelan. Jim is the World Wildlife Fund's Vice President for Conservation Travel. He directs WWF's community-based conservation travel programs, serves as the technical lead for WWF's partnerships with private sector travel companies, and oversees the organization's educational trips for WWF's most committed members and supporters. And Court has been guiding with NatHab Worldwide since 2013 and is our Director of Sustainability in Conservation Travel. Thanks for being with us today, gentlemen. Court, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kendall. Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Jim, for joining as well. So yeah, welcome, folks in the audience. If you've become a routine or repeat viewer, you're probably wondering, well, gosh, Court's talking today. Is he going to talk about photography in the age of COVID or conservation travel? No, we're going to put that on hold and we'll resume next week. This is my other major passion when it comes to travel and really just life in general, is the idea of conservation travel. So that's going to be a major theme of today's talk. So before I ramble on too much, I'd like to hand the floor over to Jim. If you get a chance to read Jim's full bio, he is a very impressive figure in the world of conservation travel and tourism. Truly, he won't probably mention this because he's very humble, but a true icon. I mean, he was really one of the major pioneers for this idea of ecotourism and conservation travel for many years. So it's a privilege to be presenting alongside him. Jim, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Court and Kendall, and I am very thank you for this opportunity to really take a deeper dive and look at how COVID-19 is impacting the travel industry and livelihoods, and also our conservation programs. And so for many of you who may not be familiar, the travel industry is actually the third largest industry in the world. It's $7 trillion. It employs 1 in 10 employees in the world. It's the largest service sector employer. And it, as you might know, having been on trips, it is one of the top export earners around the world. In 48 less developed countries, it's a number 1 or 2 top export earner. And in 60 countries, tourism is throughout the world is the top export earner. So throughout the world, there are 202 terrestrial and marine protected areas with 8 billion visitors or visits to these areas. So as you might imagine, all these travelers, you all know, spend a lot of money in and around these protected areas, and these this money goes to fund the stewardship of these protected areas, everything from game guards to just the general management of the parks. And so it also is a big generator to fund the protection of cultural heritage sites as well.
Mm-hmm. So once, this will be kind of a little bit of a conversation sort of back and forth. And one thing I wanted to mention very quickly is often when I start presentations like this, I like to sort of define my why. And I think this is probably very similar to Jim's why, is that travel has the ability to save the world. When you look at photos that we've shown so far, the wildlife, the cultures, the people, the livelihoods, the local communities, these all benefit from this idea of conservation travel, this idea of sustainable travel that goes to protect nature, the wildlife, and communities of the world. And the whole idea, and I could talk, for 2 more presentations just on this one topic, but the idea is that when you spend, when you have this money, when you have this financial backbone to an industry, it adds value to natural landscapes that could otherwise perhaps be turned into something else, forests cut down for timber, rivers polluted by mining. And what it does, it doesn't say to local people that, hey, you can't do your livelihood. It says, hey, keep these areas protected, and we're going to give you a better way to earn money. And all the data out there, which I think we're going to get to in a little bit, will show there's significantly more money to be had from conservation travel, from sustainable travel, significantly more in the long run versus short-term, deleterious processes, extractive processes.
And that is indeed correct. And it was actually validated last year in a study that one of the WWF senior scientists, Robin Naidu, conducted. And he looked at 600 protected areas in 34 less developed countries, looking at how tourism, sustainable tourism, contributes not only to the livelihoods of the local people, but also to the health benefits, the education benefits, and ultimately the money that circles back to help protect our national parks and all different forms of protected areas. And so what he found in this study was quite amazing, that those protected areas that have tourism in and around those areas, that for the local communities, they had 17% higher wealth levels, 16% lower likelihood of poverty, and 10% of the kids that are living in those areas have higher height to weight scores. And so, with the devastating impact of COVID-19, as you all no doubt know, this has really shut down the travel industry. And currently for this year, it's forecasted that there'll be 1.1 billion fewer international travelers, about $1.2 trillion in lost export earners, and an estimated, depending upon how this all plays out, anywhere between 100 and 197 million jobs lost in the travel industry. And so, as you might imagine, and I'll let Court take over in a little bit, the tourism supply chain is enormous. When you think about all the different companies and individuals that are feeding into the making of a trip that you go on, there are many, many different pieces of the puzzle. And so this is not only affecting the actual travel companies, but again, this whole value chain. The dark green is all the kind of the direct providers of travel services, and the light green is those that are the indirect providers of services to the industry. Court, did you?
And hopefully, yeah, you can go ahead and go on to the next slide here, please. Hopefully on that slide, you were taking notes, because there will be extensive test questions on each one of those boxes. No, but really I mean, it's sort of the purpose that it's immense. You can't possibly read all that in 30 seconds, let alone really understand it, over a lifetime of work of the intricacies and depth that the tourism industry has. And that's the whole reason why it's one of the largest foreign exchange earners for so many countries in the world. Many times outside of subsistence agriculture, tourism is the way people make the most money. So it's very significant because there's so many key players involved. And of course, the more overt, more obvious things we're going to kind of laundry list here. This one right here, guides. As a guide myself from time to time, guides are very much at the heart of it. And oftentimes the guides around the world, they work with certain companies much more than others, but they happen to be freelance. And when they're not guiding, they're not earning their income. In addition, because guides are often some of the most educated, they're some of the most prevalent, they're some of the most informed, they're some of the most influential members of local communities, like our friend Marcos here, who's guiding one of our NatHab trips in Costa Rica. They tend to have more dependents, and it may not just be direct dependents, whether it's children, but they may be, in some cases, in developing countries, that the major funding people for local schools. They may pay for the teachers. So when you take them out of the equation, when you take, unfortunately, their livelihood out of the equation, it does affect disproportionately more people. And I know in Africa alone, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the average person, whether it's a guide, whether it's a staff member of a local camp, they typically support, for every one person employed by the tourism industry, they support on average about 14 people in the local community. So you can see quickly how tourism, conservation, travel can build up developing areas so quickly and so powerfully, but also when the tables do turn, which does happen from time to time, it also does get a little bit dismantled and defrayed at the same time. So guides like this, of course, are at the heart of it.
And then there are people in the food and beverage industry, of course, and in turn, all the farmers and other providers of food and beverage services that are impact in a very dramatic way. All the places where travelers stay as well, and then to local communities, local people who are making handicrafts, such as this individual in Laos.
Yeah, and you often think when it comes to handicrafts, you think, well, gosh, how is that a big player of everything? But it kind of leads into this topic here, which is that local communities are very, very much at the heart. And something I keep on saying is that the reason why tourism is so powerful is that it creates stakeholders in the local community. And even those people that are doing the handicrafts and selling goods, whether it's food or souvenirs, they're very much part of that local community, and they are woven into that fabric. In addition, one of the things that we are in the world of nature tourism and wildlife tourism, but one of the things we don't often realize is that local communities, the things like the handicrafts and the things that we might see, dances and performances, is that just like the natural world could be in danger of transformation, the cultural world is too. We are in an age where everybody wants an iPod and Levi jeans, and sometimes these cultural traditions are going by the wayside. And what happens with conservation travel is it incentivizes people to retain that culture, to remember how to weave those things, to remember how to make that paper like you saw in the previous slide. So the support for traditional culture throughout all this is a huge backbone of tourism too.
And so when you think that livelihoods are being affected all around the world, this has a ripple effect also to proposed threats, conservation threats to habitat and also the wildlife. And so places like Botswana, WWF and other conservation organizations are seeing increased levels of poaching. In Botswana alone, there's at least been the latest reports are that 6 rhinos have been poached.
And it seems sort of odd to say, but one of the biggest misses of not having ecotourists in the landscape is simply not having ecotourists in the landscape. And what that really comes down to is that when you have hundreds or even thousands of people in an ecosystem and they're doing game drives in the day, and then a small section are doing night drives, they are actually eyes and ears. Not only is the guide and the ranger in the vehicle, but just having people around does dissuade things like poaching, illegal hunting, habitat destruction, illegal gathering of firewood and water. It's the eyes and ears. I mean, ecotourists are indeed part of that protection. They are the eyes and ears. So unfortunately, they're not there. It does lessen the overall level of protection.
So as you all know about seeing or experiencing, there is this great urge for the travel industry to recover. And so when looking at some of the things that need to happen for the industry to recover, obviously the big one is public health solutions, which are still a big question mark at this point in time. But I think more importantly, getting back to some of our earlier comments, what this has caused is a big liquidity crisis around the world. When you think about countries like Costa Rica or Ecuador or Nepal or countries like Namibia, this has really slammed their economy. And so on a very short order, 90 countries have requested emergency relief from the IMF and G20 countries. And in Africa alone, sub-Saharan Africa, a whole coalition of very significant travel trade organizations have put out a request to provide $10 billion of relief to small and medium-sized enterprises. And so the other thing is for companies like NatHab, and looking at, what is it really going to take to create the conditions to alleviate the objective risks that are hopefully defined by science, and also to mitigate the subjective or the perceived risks on the part of the travelers once conditions are stabilized.
Yeah, and it's interesting on this level too. So one thing is for sure is that we will collectively see the other side of this. Like that is going to happen. But we have to position ourselves that it's not going to be a light switch. No one's going to come on TV and say, guys, it's okay. So what we're likely to see, and this is just from my experience in the travel industry, and also frankly with like research and statistics, is that a lot of things happen in a bell curve sort of shape of way. What we're likely to see with travel and tourism is that in general, travelers are some of the more adventurous. They're some of the more extroverted. They're some of the more risk tolerant people. So we do expect when the other side of this is, we do see it, things are going to bounce back. There's going to be very likely some pent up demand. We're likely to see that front end of the bell curve a little bit more inflated compared to the average person that may never really travel or want to get out of their home. So we do expect that when this happens, there will be a bit of a flood, but it's going to have to happen with all the right precautions. And I will invite you, this is not the time to really go over it, but I was reading on actually our website, the precautions that NatHab is setting up to take on all of our trips around the world. It's really quite impressive. I really give major kudos to our, what we call our operations team, for understanding that and reviewing the scenarios, and also working with the travel industry in general. I think that's one of the interesting silver linings of all this, is that the banding together of the travel company, competitive companies, completely disjointed areas of the industry are coming together to share best practices, share understanding, share what they've learned from various things. And I think that we're all going to be, quite a bit better because of it. But if you do have a chance, it's quite interesting to see on our website as to what we're looking like going forward.
Right, and across the adventure travel industry, at least, one of the interesting things that we're picking up is that 75 to 95% of those travelers, which I kind of call the early adopters, are those who are more interested in traveling to destinations that are kind of at the leading edge. They're hanging in there. And one of the things that we've seen in the past, if you look at the trajectory of recovery once conditions stabilize, is that the market comes back fairly quickly. Even if you look at around 2008, or when 9/11 and Gulf War II and the SARS pandemic happened right around here. Again, once conditions stabilize, the market picks right back up, and there's a lot of pent-up demand. And this also is not only great for the industry, but it also poses a threat to with ever increasing numbers of travelers. This is a diagram on the number of aircraft that were currently before COVID was around 23,500, and it was projected to go up to near 46,000 by the year 2036. Obviously, that's not going to necessarily happen, but that was the trajectory. And so, again, what the situation has created is both is a threat, the immediate threat to the industry, but also potential long-term opportunities to create or recover in a greener way.
Yeah, so I've been studying this idea of ecotourism or conservation travel for several decades now, and still to this day, it is the fastest growing sector of the fastest growing industry in the world, being conservation travel amongst the entire tourism stage. And what that shows us is that people are more apt, they're more keen than ever to do this idea of sustainable travel, to do travel in the right way, to have a low footprint, to invest that money, those tourism dollars in local communities, to make sure that everybody gets a slice of the finances coming in. So I think, as an eternal optimist, what I see right now is that we have this potential as the tourism world kind of reshapes and maybe pivots a little bit at this time. I think that we may see this unprecedented shift towards sustainable tourism. Unprecedented may not be exactly the right way to put it, because we've seen this coming for a while, but as companies do reshape and reshift, as some of the larger companies reshape and shift, cruise lines, et cetera, it's a time to maybe focus more on sustainability. And as we'll see in a few slides here, it could be that in some ways the lack of environmental insight, the lack of sustainability could have contributed to where we're at right now. So I think that more than ever before, we're going to see the entire tourism industry shift towards what has been the writing on the wall, this demand from the consumer for a sustainable way to travel the world.
Yeah, and what you see on the screen right now are the results of a couple surveys, one by American Express and the other by last year by Booking.com, that there's an increasing interest and willingness on the part of travelers to travel in a more sustainable way. So in many respects, this is an unprecedented opportunity, or what I like to call a market correction opportunity, to shape the future of travel. And that is to influence the recovery strategies, create more innovative, sustainable, and resilient solutions. And then, and here's the intriguing part that we're looking at, is to link recovery capital to sustainable practices. And I think, again, as Court pointed out, and this is a quote from a New Yorker writer, Kate Brown, the coronavirus is not only a public health crisis, but it is an ecological one, as we're seeing. And so a number of organizations have really are beginning to look at how the travel industry recovers. One of the more prominent ones right now is the United Nations World Tourism Organization, that has come up with a blueprint, a one planet vision for a responsible recovery of the tourism sector. And there are 4 pillars in terms of recovery: climate, biodiversity conservation, social inclusion, circular economy, and governance and finance, which very nicely fit with a lot of the priorities that WWF had in terms of its goals and conservation mission. And so these pillars are based on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And apologize for the small print, but there are 17 different goals. And the basic structure of these Sustainable Development Goals is that you need a healthy biosphere and a viable biosphere to be able to achieve some of the societal goals. So, for example, over here in number 13 is the climate action. And unless you get that right, then all of these other areas of societal well-being and the economy are, it's going to be very difficult to accomplish those sustainable development goals. And so this is obviously very complicated and requires, at the end of the day, number 17 at the top, partnerships. And so these are kind of all the different areas that that WWF is engaged in terms of working with governments, multilateral development banks, communities, non-governmental organizations, of which WWF is one, and then also the private sector.
Yeah, and of course, for this to work, like you saw on the slide before, another slide that will be on the test in essay form. So again, hopefully everybody's taking notes. Kidding, but yeah, so these all have to be working at the same time. And now, of course, when I think of the NatHab World Wildlife Fund partnership, that is, a grouping between the private sector and an NGO. But nevertheless, the rest of these guys have to be working at the same time. Just a quick little bit of a backstory. I think, if you've traveled with NatHab out there in the audience, you probably know a bit more about this, or at least if you've been in our email list for a while, you probably understand the partnership. But it's the idea that you have a private sector company, a for-profit company, working with one of the nonprofits, the greatest in the world, World Wildlife Fund. And the idea is that we are both doing what we do best in essence. Yet travel, again, just like we believe, World Wildlife Fund believes that it's one of the most powerful ways to save the world. And in fact, it's one of their major initiatives to get conservation travel out there to increase the value of wildlife and natural landscapes. So, our partnership is now over 15 years strong, and the idea is that, you know, we want to do conservation, but we want to entrust that with the experts, just like how travel is in the reverse.
Right. And so the whole recovery solutions and how WWF's approaches in general is a science-based decision making. And again, here are the 5 different pillars in terms of the UN's tourism recovery strategy. And the first one, climate, is of course, even before COVID, very prominent. You know, currently, for example, 75% of the world's coral reefs are threatened. And that the amount of tourism that is connected to coral reefs is $10 billion. And so at the end of the day, healthy coral reefs are a huge tourism asset. And so the initiatives under climate are to monitor and report emissions for travel companies, to decarbonize the operations of the travel companies, and then lastly, carbon removal and restoration of high carbon density ecosystems.
Yeah, and you know what this comes down to is it's not just that we are a bunch of environmentalists and conservation biologists here, which of course we are, but you know, as a business, you have to think, you know, we have to frankly protect our assets, and our assets are the natural world. So that's where I love this marriage between the finances and the business and the conservation, is that actually to do good business, you have to save the world. You have to protect the coral reefs, you have to protect the animals. Now, of course, we're doing it for many, many reasons. It's you know, finances are the least of our concern on that. We're doing so to save the world. But when you can speak a common language that it is more financially viable to protect these areas because of the ecosystem services, we'll get to biodiversity here in a second, all that it provides, it actually is a long-term positive play for the world. Everyone will be propped up as we protect these things. So one of the things that we are doing, and we've been so fortunate to pioneer the way on here at Natural Habitat, is this idea of carbon removal or carbon offsetting. So if you're familiar with NatHab, we have been a carbon neutral travel company since 2007, and very proud to be a part of that. And actually, as the head of sustainability, it's one of my main goals is to do those carbon calculations and invest in projects around the world like reforestation, which actually helps sequester carbon from the atmosphere. We are investing in alternative energy, sustainable energy like wind farms and solar farms. We are also doing things like providing hyper-efficient cook stoves to rural villages in Rwanda, providing water filters to Southeast Asia. And what those latter 2 things actually do is prevent excess carbon from being emitted in the first place. So when it comes to this idea of carbon removal, carbon sequestration, and carbon offsetting, it's really an entire picture. And the great thing is that, you know, travel is helping lead the way, like it does on a lot of things, lead the vanguard on new thinking and new sustainability initiatives. And I think that some of our travelers will learn about this either in presentations like this or on trips and want to be part of it outside of this initiative on the trips itself. And that's how we get this kind of this megaphone to the public. This is how we kind of shout it from the mountaintops and explain and teach folks what's possible in the world of sustainability, even outside of travel and daily lives.
Yeah, and again, recognizing that all forms of travel have an impact. And you're looking at trying to really try to do this in the most responsible way and try to use travel as a tool for conservation. So the second strategy in terms of tourism recovery is biodiversity conservation. And that is to invest in nature-based solutions, capture the value of conservation through tourism, and to protect natural barriers for zoonotic diseases.
And actually, on the biodiversity thing, I'll jump in here real quick. And you know, I just kind of wrote a little article about this in an email to the company at NatHab. And you know, biodiversity, for those that do not understand what it is, it's you know, basically the roots of the word, you know, the biological diversity of the earth. But the implications are much more significant than that. I mean, essentially what biodiversity conservation is, well, it's frankly my biggest concern for the planet. It's the lack of biodiversity that will hamper and hinder ecosystem functioning, from things like pollination to nutrient cycling to the water cycle, to food, to productivity, to energy. All that is rooted in biodiversity. But really what biodiversity is not just the entire assemblage of species on Earth. it's kind of like this genetic memory for the last, billion years of life on Earth. Like, we are all here because our predecessors were able to survive major catastrophic events, major famines, floods, what we call stochastic events in the environment, hurricanes, earthquakes. And so all that genetic memory has led to the present day forms of life on Earth. So preserving that genetic memory is actually preserving the intelligence of how to continue to thrive on the planet. So it goes much more beyond just saying we want to see as many pretty birds and bumblebees as possible. It's actually preserving that intelligence throughout many, many years of evolution that got us to where we are today.
Yeah, and again, wildlife and biodiversity conservation figures hugely in with respect to being a tourism asset for sub-Saharan Africa. The other component for biodiversity conservation is stopping illegal wildlife trafficking and closure of high-risk markets, particularly again for zoonotic diseases. So WWF has been really focusing on this even before COVID, because wildlife tourism is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $120 billion. In contrast to what the activity, the $23 billion of illegal wildlife trafficking. So wildlife tourism is worth far more than, and really illegal wildlife trafficking is compromising, again, the travel industry. And then to again make this connection between public health and conservation, the conservation efforts serve as a natural barrier, and again, we're all seeing the downside, economic downsides due to COVID. And so WWF, before COVID, has been very active in working with the travel industry in airports and travel companies around the world to educate travelers and to identify ways to also create incentives for the travel industries to combat illegal wildlife trafficking.
And I think one of the many ways that we can demonstrate how well we work together as two organizations is this example here, in that so World Wildlife Fund, as the entity that understands the best practices, will look at the tourism industry and we'll say, okay, great. So these companies are going here. How do we instill best practices for the Arctic? When people are up there polar bear viewing, when they're down in Antarctica looking at whales and penguins, what are the best ways to keep that ecosystem pristine and pure, keep the wildlife safe, and enable it to be as pristine so in generations to come, it's just as much of a spectacle. So we can kind of play off of each other as us being the travel arm. We can be out there implementing the best practices, honing them, reporting back to World Wildlife Fund, and we kind of develop some of these things together where we are very integral in protecting the assets that make this idea of conservation travel so valuable.
And then another element in terms of biodiversity conservation is creating protected areas, or rewilding, as we say, as in this project on the drawing boards, reintroducing tigers into the eastern part of Cambodia. And that is very much tied into, it's not only creating these protected areas for wildlife, but it also is to create opportunities for communities to benefit from wildlife. And so the other pillar in terms of the strategy is social inclusion, and that conservation is inextricably linked to the education and sustainable economic benefits for vulnerable communities, especially women. And the travel industry disproportionately employs large numbers of women.
Absolutely. And this is the idea, that community-based facet of conservation travel, of ecotourism, is that, one of the key ingredients to all this is you employ local folks, you train local folks, they become the guides, they become the managers, they become the owners. You provide that seed funding when it's appropriate to purchase camps and run camps, and you're essentially creating stakeholders. You can't just really go into these areas and put up fences and give people fines for going into protected areas. You have to create stakeholders of the local community saying, hey, you are closest to this protected area, you are most adept, you have the highest potential for keeping it safe, And the incentive to you for keeping it safe is having a wonderful livelihood by running camps, by running restaurants and hotels, creating stakeholders via community-based tourism as part of this conservation travel concept.
Right. But again, it's not only the communities, but it also is creating partnerships with small to medium-sized enterprises out in country. And partnerships such that the community benefits, but also the private enterprise benefits to create the right incentives across the value chain. WWF also works across many different sectors of the travel industry. And this goes to the next part of the pillar of recovery, and that's circular economy, transform the value chain. And so WWF works with some of the largest hotel chains in the world, including Hilton and Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines, to improve their sustainability practices from everything from emissions to destination management and sourcing. And so one of the big areas that we're working with is sustainable sourcing and also food waste.
And this speaks a lot to what we have been trialing out in the field. So once again, I think it's this amazing partnership where we can take these lessons, explore them in the field where it's actually working. And a great example is our zero waste trip. If you've tuned in maybe probably about a month ago now, maybe a few weeks, we did a special webinar in this Daily Dose series specifically on our zero waste adventure, the world's first zero waste adventure. And one of the most incredible findings, one of the most important findings, was that food waste in the travel and tourism industry is probably bigger than we had ever thought. There are stats out there that the average American, or in America, about 40% of food created goes uneaten. And there's no reason to think that that does not necessarily happen in the tourism industry. And in some cases, it may be even higher than that. But the flip side of that, and you'd have to watch that whole webinar to get all the ins and outs, but the flip side is that it's actually one of the most easily solvable issues. So we're very optimistic that this is one of the things that we can tackle vehemently in the coming years to lessen food waste in travel and tourism.
And it is also one of the top climate solutions too, food waste is. I should back up one more thing. And that is WWF has been working again with travel trade organizations like the American Hotels and Lodging Association to develop toolkits, and also this online training company for the hospitality industry, Lobster Inc., to develop training for different types of jobs within the hospitality industry.
And just real quickly, Jim, the thing you mentioned about global greenhouse gas emissions and food waste, a couple of interesting stats out there, some fun facts. So we often look at the tourism industry as one of the offenders in terms of you can't get around jet travel if you wish to go to Africa. It's a heck of a long boat ride. But nevertheless, we will argue that the pros certainly outweigh the cons in terms of the conservation value. We're in a triage situation in some of these cases, and we have to add value to these natural ecosystems. But when you look at the numbers, tourism in general is about, and this is everything to do with tourism, is about 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. There are much larger industries like energy, agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. The food waste alone, just the food that is wasted, accounts, believe it or not, for about 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So when I look at all the positive that conservation travel and tourism can do, and I look at how easy it would be if we were all united together to drastically lessen that 11% number, I think that travel and tourism and the positives have some of the most powerful tools to tackle that, just because of the influence that we have as an industry.
And then the other facet in terms of circular economy is elimination of plastics, recycling, and waste management. And again, this is another area that WWF has been active in. Just recently published a plastics guide for hotels. And Court, I know NatHab has, in terms of your trips that you have been pioneering, have been really focusing in on this area.
It is, yeah. We have strived to go plastic free, or sorry, single-use plastic free on our trips, and we've been leading that crusade for going on 12 years now. These things are, of course, not overnight successes, but we have developed tools and templates through a series of letters and communications to hotels, asking them how to do this, working with them. And we've also been able to ping those strategies, like email templates and letters out to the industry, so they can also join us in this quest to go plastic free, to minimize the number of single-use plastic water bottles in rooms, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, again, it allows us to help lead that vanguard and shape the industry, which then shapes the world.
The last pillar is, in terms of recovery, is governance and finance. And again, we're looking at the opportunities that COVID presents to recover in a way to address some of the big issues that you've no doubt heard about before, over-tourism, and some of the more iconic destinations, be that Galapagos or Venice or Barcelona or Machu Picchu, or and in some cases under-tourism. Those areas that are really not yet on the radar screen for travel and tourism that could benefit to, again, create these financial benefits for local communities to preserve their natural and cultural resources. And so WWF has been working on, in certain areas like the Mesoamerican Reef in the Yucatan Peninsula, Belize, and Roatan, to look at, and throughout the world, to look at global marine and coastal tourism strategies, best practices in terms of how to best plan for the long term for sustainability and resiliency. And then the question becomes, well, where do you get the money? Again, linking capital to sustainability. And we have been very active in terms of collaborating with the World Bank, the Global Environmental Fund, the German government, the Australian government, and on to look at how do you create these partnerships, joint ventures with the private sector and the communities to leverage resources and to have not only good livelihood incomes, but also conservation gains as well. This intersection, again, between poverty alleviation for institutions like the World Bank, and conservation is really, and livelihoods is really a powerful one in terms of where we're looking forward to for collaboration. There are case studies that are emerging. Again, this is one of the things I might recommend if you're interested in learning more, and Kendall will be providing resources in terms of how to get these publications that the World Bank and World Travel and Tourism Council and the United Nations World Tourism Organizations are actively looking at travel as a solution, the sustainable travel as a solution to advanced livelihoods and conservation outcomes. And what we're seeing as a result of COVID in terms of the benefits, some of you may know I started off my career in the National Park Service working at Yosemite, is that COVID is actually started to address some issues right now. It just happened a couple of weeks ago. In 1980, I was involved as part of the master planning team for Yosemite. And at that time, the visitation levels for Yosemite was about 2.5 million. And last year was 4.5 million. And one of the things that we really wanted to do back in 1980 was to control the amount of day use visitation, but we were never able to do so. Fast forward to today, or just last weekend, they instituted this day use permit system to limit, not only for COVID purposes, social distancing, but this creates the gateway to ultimately deal with some of the over-tourism and impact issues for just a sheer number of travelers going to some of our crown jewel national parks. So I think in the interest of time, we will end there and open it up for questions that you might have about this whole area that we've been talking with today about this intersection between tourism, livelihoods, and conservation and public-private partnerships.
Thank you. We do have a good variety of questions for you guys. First, I'd like to remind everyone watching that you can submit questions for Jim and Court via the questions field in your control panel, and we'll get to as many as we can by the top of the hour. All right, guys, first question. Has NatHab resumed some of their journeys in some areas?
We are just starting to test the waters on that. As you can imagine, it's with great care, great planning and forethought. We know that those that are most feasible right now are those metaphorically and literally in our own backyard in those national parks to the west. So we are trialing with those people that are keen. Again, that vanguard, that forefront, the first movers to some trips to Yellowstone this summer. Mm-hmm.
Great. And there are a lot of questions about traveling currently, and admittedly and understandably, there's a lot of trepidation about that. Until there's a vaccine, what are your thoughts about traveling currently?
Mm-hmm. Well, sure, I'll go first, and Jim, feel free to jump in. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. I think that we are in a world that has certainly changed in the last few months, and that there is now a bit of risk in almost everything that we do related to COVID. I think ultimately that person or those people hit the nail on the head, is that the vaccine is going to be the really key part of the equation, because what we're looking at in terms of travel is it's not just going to a remote safari camp in Botswana. Frankly, I think that is probably one of the safer places to be amongst all this. But it's the travel to get there, and I think that those places that take the most travel to get there are going to have a little bit higher risk. Now you juxtapose that, or you contrast that with, they're also some of the most incredible, magnanimous places on earth. They're on the quote unquote bucket list, the safari, seeing snow leopards, watching orangutans in Borneo. They are notably distant from the US and do require more travel, but they're also some of the most sensational things that are once in a lifetime adventures. So I think that it will pick back up. I think air travel is always going to be like one of the biggest question marks for folks. But then once you get to these places, I think that it is relatively solvable to maintain extremely good practices. And like I mentioned, I won't go into it here, but there's a six process sort of procedure that we're going into in terms of training, vetting, screening, sanitizing, hygiene, all this sort of stuff. And again, the entire travel industry is looking at these documents and these procedures at a similar rate and similar level. So I think that for those people that are the early movers, it will be probably sooner than later for the big international travel to resume again.
Right. And I would just echo what Court said in terms of a vaccine, and also greater prevalence of testing as well. Certainly, my wife would concur. My wife's an emergency physician, and who's on the front lines, and we're currently we're calling it marital distancing, and we're I will take my lead from her in terms of when she feels that the conditions are stable enough to travel. Again, we're not. I think as those of us who've been in the venture travel business for a long time, you can't eliminate all the risk, of course. And the question is, what is going to be prudent going into the future? And that definitely remains to be seen. It'll vary from destination to destination. You've probably heard about these travel bubbles, like between New Zealand and Australia, where they really did a good job in terms of controlling the number of cases and hospitalizations and such. And so they're very much looking at opening up travel between the two countries, but nobody else.
And then, just to finish that, one of the big things is that, you have these subjective and objective risks, or preferences. You have, is it safe to do so? Do we deem it, looking at the World Health Organization, CDC, myriad of various agencies, but then it ultimately comes down to, do our travelers feel like it? So, I mean, I can't say if it's like exactly 50-50, but frankly, I'd say we probably put even more weight on, travelers, like, are you ready to get back? So we're doing a lot of surveying and question asking, making sure that, we time this right so that people that want to go are able to go, understanding what they're getting into. But, there's no point in trying to run trips if people are not ready to go. So a big part of that is understanding the mindset of our travelers. And that's a huge part of the equation, huge part of the daily tasks for us.
Absolutely, thank you. One more travel related question. If it takes another year or so to recover from COVID and begin traveling again, how difficult will it be to reassemble the on-ground support that we receive in these destinations?
Jim, you want to start with that one, or?
Well, of course, it depends upon the destination. And if you take a destination like the Galapagos, for example, those boats are still going to be there, and albeit the crews are going to be struggling, and all of the value chain associated with that. But there's a lot of investment tied up in those boats, and you can bet that once the conditions stabilize, then when you look at alternatives for those people who were otherwise working on those boats or in safari camps or a number of other tourism operations, there isn't much alternative, especially if tourism is the number one job creator in that destination. So you can bet that, again, when conditions stabilize, they're going to want to come back to those jobs as quick as they can.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think that's exactly what it is. Everybody knows it will be back. And what will happen is if the labor force or if the camps or infrastructure is not able to withstand, or if it's not able to rejoin all this and not able to start where we left off, there's gonna be a lot of potential income left on the table. So I think that a lot of these folks, whether it's camp owners, lodge owners, guides and safari operators and all that sort of stuff, and unless if they bail on this now, it's going to be way too much left on the table. So they're really trying to kind of push the pause button and ride out the storm. And I can tell you that there's still, uncertainty, and whether it's 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 14 months from now, 18 months from now, that we do see the other side of this. Each one of those, I mean, every week makes a huge difference. But that's why we're initiating things like the Community Relief Fund. That's why we're taking a lot of consideration to help pay the wages of those folks that are not working right now, to keep them fed, keep them healthy, keep their kids in school in remote villages in Africa, to make sure that they can weather this storm. Because once there is that, that magic on-off switch, whether it's a vaccine or something else, the pent-up demand, I mean, we're already seeing 2021 being one of the busiest years to date, because people are looking at it and say, well, gosh, I mean, I want to get to Africa, and they're looking at that as the right time. So yeah, I think it's a lot of just hanging tight, pushing the pause button, and waiting for it to resume. And I think it will be mostly at capacity, in terms of the same capacity we've had before all this. I think it will resume.
And when you look at what happened with STARS, albeit that was a much smaller scale incident, but throughout Asia, it was pretty catastrophic for the travel industry. It shut down. Again, once conditions came, the public health issue was addressed, then the travel industry came back stronger than ever, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, switching gears a little bit, this goes back to your slide on wildlife trafficking. What are the major difficulties in closing high-risk markets?
Well, the big one is that you need government buy-in, support, and enforcement, and that poses the question: where are these wildlife markets? And so we've already seen with the government of China that they have taken steps to close these markets. And WWF is working, WWF has an office in Beijing and Shanghai, and we're working very closely with governments, not only with the Chinese government, but other governments throughout Asia to close these markets. And it's not only in Asia, but it's also, you know, on the African continent as well. And so WWF will shortly release a COVID zoonotic response plan that we can post on the resource site, so you all can look at the details of that plan.
Great. We've got time for a few more questions. So we'll switch gears again, and going back to your discussion about food waste, Court, this person says, having seen the waste of food in amusement parks that reflect abundance of food available similar to grocery stores, how can food waste be reduced?
Well, you know, I think it's a bottom up and it's a top down approach. And, you know, what I mean by that is that the individual consumer has to take responsibility to potentially influence the top down, meaning that if you consume less, if you're more aware of it, if you use your voice, use your vote, you know, it's all a consumer driven business. You know, if you stop going to XYZ amusement park, there won't be ticket sales and people won't be there. Now that's an extreme example, but if you start using your decisions and start using your voice and requesting less or different ways of doing things, the top down will respond. Now, then you also have the idea that, you know, maybe this is again kind of a random example, but a good example nonetheless. The amusement park owner goes with us on one of our trips and sees how we are able to reduce food waste in remote safari camps. And that person is one of the influencers of our world. You know, they are a CEO, they're a business owner, and they see how it's being done and they become inspired. And that's one of the biggest things that I think that we can do as a company is inspire those folks that have a hand at making the change from top down. But again, you know, the management, the people that make those decisions, that help buy the food, that institute policies, as well as the people that are actually consuming and buying and making those decisions have to meet in the middle. And it's chicken or the egg. I don't know exactly who moves first, but I think that we have access to both. And I know that we probably have both in the audience here, and they will converge at that sweet spot. But it does take time. It does take time. But nevertheless, I think that there has to be people out there talking about it, people out there understanding solutions, experimenting, taking risks with leading zero waste adventures. And it provides a little bit of a roadmap. But then there's a lot of other steps. I mean, I think, you know, I've said this many times, is that, you know, this world's first zero waste adventure, it was 12 travelers. That's great. But that's a drop in the bucket. You know, yes, we've informed and changed the lives of 12 travelers, but we don't need 12 people doing zero waste perfectly. We need 1 million people doing it imperfectly. And that's what we're setting out to do, is to be that megaphone to teach the world how it can be done with examples from the field.
And to that point, a lot of what WWF works on, we try to achieve scale. And so the food waste toolkit that I mentioned previously, that was underwritten by the Rockefeller Foundation, and to pilot this toolkit to some of the largest travel companies in the world, Marriott, Hilton, Hyatt. It's also, the team is focusing on the cruise lines for the Caribbean. And in this pilot test, food waste was reduced by as much as anywhere between 10 and 38%. And when you think about food costs for restaurants and hotels and everything, it's significant. And so if you can create these financial incentives for these companies to reduce their food waste, it's not only good for their bottom line, but it's also good for climate as well.
And, you know, at the end of the day, this what I'm about to tell you kind of goes for any sort of conservation thing out there, whether your own individual interest and quest is to minimize food waste, or whether it's plastics, whether it's climate and carbon emissions. You know, if what I think would save the world, frankly, if you wanted to hear, is to create a worldwide conservation culture. And what that means is getting everybody to think about conservation as much as possible. I think there's a great example with the country of Costa Rica. If you've ever been there, you know that this conservation culture is palpable. I mean, everybody thinks about it and everybody does it, the vast majority of people. So the more you participate, the more you think about it, the more conversations you have, the more you use your purchasing power to make that decision, that more sustainable decision, the more this conservation culture is perpetuated. And I think that that's the power that we have as consumers, is to help amplify and propagate that thinking. So even just telling friends, even writing blog posts, even just doing anything you can to continue that story helps create the conservation culture, and then that makes it permeates every level of these hierarchical organizations, whether it's amusement parks, governments, you name it. So again, I think even though it seems like maybe your decisions may be a drop in the bucket for the grand scheme of things, it's a huge force for good for creating that conservation culture. One of the things I think is most important.
And you know, we are at this transformative moment in time, where obviously there's a lot of tragedy in the world, but it again is really this unprecedented opportunity to really rethink the travel industry and look towards, you know, how can it recover in a more sustainable, resilient way.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to stop, and we're at the top of the hour anyway. So I'd like to turn it back over to you guys for some closing comments, and we'll start with Court.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate the attendance. I think that this is hopefully a transformative mindset. If some of this stuff is new to you, I probably should have saved my statements about conservation culture to just now, because it is it is that powerful closing statement that I really want to get across, is that, you know, we all have the power to make change. And I think that conservation travel is really just a big megaphone that reaches more people with more power, but we all have that power in our day-to-day lives. So use it, learn it, learn from us. There's a lot more resources we have out there, and you know, help us protect the planet. And you know, that the wonderful thing about conservation travel is you are saving the world on your vacation, which is a really cool win-win.
And Jim?
And my closing comment is, I can't wait to get out there and experience nature and the things that kind of nourish us in our travel experiences. I'm totally counting the days to really be out there and go on trips where we can experience the true benefits of nature and communities.
Absolutely. Well, Jim and Court, thank you so much. This presentation was absolutely wonderful. And I want to thank everyone who joined us to watch today. And be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll get that replay out to you soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.